Nothing happening here is out of the ordinary apart from the peak fear narrative. These things don't come often, but when they come, they're a goddamn fucking gift.
투자 미디어 플랫폼 리얼비전의 창립자이자 비트코인에 대한 선구적인 통찰로 세계의 주목을 받아온 라울팔. 그가 2025년 4월 암호화폐 시장은 어디에 와 있는지 그리고 매크로 시장은 어떻게 변화하고 있는지에 대해 이야기했습니다. 그 핵심 내용을 지금부터 함께 확인해 보시죠.
I've said before, everything is demographics. The labor force participation rate is a representation of the demographics in the US economy. The US is better than others. Europe has worse demographics, Japan worse, China worse. But this is what drives economies, inflation, and it also drives government debt. As the population ages out, this chart is one that I'm surprised that nobody's copied from us and is probably the single most important chart in all of macro. Government debt is a function of aging populations. It is there to paste over the cracks. If you remember, GDP growth equals population growth plus productivity growth plus debt growth. Debt growth is the part that is papering over GDP growth. It is filling in the cracks. It is very important that you all understand this. But as debt to GDP increases, it becomes harder and harder to figure out how to finance it. So what comes along is the use of liquidity. Now, we've used Fed net liquidity here. We'll talk about total liquidity later. The governments have shifted, the central banks and governments have shifted from originally balance sheet use back in 2008 when everything blew up till about Draghi and just after that period. Then they started using net liquidity. That's when you use the Treasury General Account. That's when you use the reverse repo. So you're bringing in the private sector into this and the government balance sheet, not just the central bank balance sheet. And in recent times, they've moved beyond that to use total liquidity, which includes the banking sector. But basically, all liquidity is there is to service the government debt. This chart is incredibly important for you to understand. So zooming in where we are today, you can see that US total liquidity, so that includes the banking sector now, which is the new mechanism by which they're absorbing the debts and mandating banks to hold more government bonds. You can see it follows this debt to GDP chart. This is the interest payments going forwards, and here is liquidity rising to meet it. This is how you service the massive debts. You pay the interest. You do it via currency debasement. That's what liquidity is. It's a fancy word for currency debasement. And total liquidity is the way that they've been doing it. Now, this is not new. This was all done after World War II, when at the same time the world was massively in debt. We had lost a large part of the working population via war. And we then had to erode the debt via financial repression. Financial repression is when you keep yields lower than growth or lower than inflation, but generally lower than growth, nominal growth. And what happens is that over time, GDP rises, but debt doesn't rise as fast as GDP, and you erode away the debt. And that's via debasement. So that was very common in the 1950s. That lasted about 2 decades. We're about, where are we now? 2008. We're almost 2 decades into this episode. And interestingly enough, the S&P now very much follows the S&P in the 1950s. We had this perfect 4-year cyclicality that plays out very similar to the cyclicality now. That cyclicality is the debt refinancing cycle. But imagine you could see it. You can see all of these colors, and basically each color is a year. And in liquidity terms, these are broken into seasons. So we're currently coming into the fall season, is when you tend to see the main debts roll. So we've got about 9 or 10 trillion of debts to roll this year, and you need a large increase in liquidity. The last cycle, 2020, most of the liquidity actually came earlier because of COVID. But generally speaking, the liquidity cycle is this year. So we're expecting an expansion of liquidity. Now, there's various proxies for liquidity. Global liquidity is the important one, but it lags global M2, which is a faster reported series. Global M2 is driven a lot by the dollar, plus all of the private sectors and the government sectors around the world. So we found that these two have been really what matters. So when we think, now these are global numbers, everyone gets confused. The Fed are going to cut rates. It's irrelevant. It's irrelevant. It's this global liquidity that pays the global debts. Don't forget, 50% of the entire world's debts are in US dollars. That's one of the things that Scott Bessent has been talking about. Steve Merrin's ideas are about, is trying to reduce that. Good luck to that, but that's what it is. And it's the global cycle. So we know that the dollar is weakening. We'll talk about that later. That's a big part of this. We know that interest rates are coming lower, which is part of global liquidity and also part of financial conditions. We know that the US has been using a drawdown in the reverse repo and the Treasury general account. It will rebuild because of tax season coming now, but generally the US is injecting liquidity. It will not use the balance sheet yet, but it may well do later in the cycle. We need to see.
여기까지 라울팔이 말한 핵심을 잠깐 정리해 볼게요. GDP 성장률은 인구 증가율, 생산성 증가율, 부채 증가율로 계산되는데요. 고령화로 인해 경제활동 인구는 줄고 생산성도 둔화되면서 세수도 감소하고 있습니다. 결국 정부는 부채를 통해 경제를 지탱하려고 하고 있고, 이 부채는 이자도 내야 하고 언젠가는 갚아야 할 돈이죠. 그 빚을 갚기 위해서는 정부는 계속 돈을 찍어야 하는 상황입니다. 이게 바로 유동성 공급인 것이죠. 지금 연준은 양적 완화와 같은 방식으로 대차 대조표를 직접 늘리고 있지는 않지만 역환매 계약, 재무부 일반 계정을 줄이면서 순유동성을 늘리는 방식으로 시장에 돈을 공급하고 있다고 설명합니다. 게다가 미국 정부는 은행들로 하여금 국채를 매입하도록 유도하면서 전체 유동성도 함께 증가시키고 있습니다. 이렇게 공급된 유동성은 결국 자산시장으로 흘러 들어오게 되고 이전 사이클처럼 암호화폐 시장의 상승을 유도할 수 있다는 분석입니다.
But where the big game is to be played is China. China's balance sheet lags China bond yields. So if you remember, the US said, well, we won't ever get to QE until our bond yields get close to zero. Well, that's happening in China right now. They're in a full debt deflation. And China's going to be very important to this story. And it's the most important headline that is going to come is what the agreement is with China. The agreement with China will be, you will agree to tariff terms. We will battle it out in public and make us look like we're all strongmen. You will agree terms because you have a dollar debt problem. The Chinese have a dollar debt problem and they need to service those debts. The problem is the RMB is too weak and the dollar is too strong. They don't have the cash flows in a slow economic environment to pay for it. They know, the US knows, Yellen even went to talk to them about it when she was still at the Treasury. They need a weaker dollar. Now, the mechanism by which China gets access to those dollars is usually via the euro-dollar market, and it's Japan that is the big driver of the euro-dollar market. So when we look at the weakening of the dollar, I like to focus on dollar-yen to think of how this plays out. The yen is one of the world's big exporting economies, and it has a very weak currency. The yen needs to strengthen, and a strengthening yen and a weakening dollar will allow capital to flow into China and other dollar borrowers via the euro-dollar market. And the key thing that happens here is this chart of the Chinese currency against the yen. The Chinese currency was too strong versus the yen, and that has been putting pressure on Chinese exporters and the Chinese economy. It needs to rebalance lower. And this head and shoulders top and this head and shoulders top tell us the US, Scott Bessent, is going to get what he wants, which is a weaker dollar. A weaker dollar will stimulate global demand. It stimulates and allows for the rolling of global US dollar debts. It allows for exports and imports to free up. It allows for the movement of trade, even with tariffs. It's a very big deal, the dollar weakening. And if China can have a weakening yuan against the yen, what it allows them to do is to compete. And that rebalances global trade and gets the global growth cycle going. So China headline risk to the positive side is the big one. Everything else is kind of noise because this is the big rebalancing that the world kind of wants. Everyone has a trade-off here and everybody will come to the table for a trade-off, even China. But of course, everybody needs to look like a tough guy in negotiations, but something will happen and we will rebalance and we can move forward. This is exactly what happened last time when Trump was in power in 2017. What we had was called the Shanghai Accord. It was a kind of public, not public agreement to weaken the dollar, to allow the Chinese to stimulate, because they need a weaker dollar to stimulate because they don't want to weaken their currency via the currency band, because if not, you get a devaluation, which they do not want. So that was the Shanghai Accord then. The dollar fell dramatically and the Chinese stimulated massively. If you remember 2017, the Fed were raising rates. They were shrinking the balance sheet, but China and Europe stimulated. And that was via this mechanism. So this time around, we've got the Mar-a-Lago Accord, which is some generalized understanding that an agreement has happened.
이번엔 좀 더 글로벌한 차원의 이야기를 했습니다. 간단히 요약하자면 중국도 달러로 된 부채가 많고 경제 성장도 둔화되면서 달러가 약해져야 숨통이 트이는 상황입니다. 그리고 미국도 이 상황을 잘 알고 있어요. 그래서 겉으로는 무역 전쟁이니 관세니 하며 대립하는 척하지만 속으로는 서로에게 이득이 되는 암묵적 합의를 만들어가고 있다는 거죠. 달러가 약해지면서 세계 경제가 다시 숨을 쉬기 시작한다. 이게 라울팔이 말하는 핵심입니다. 결국 현 시장에 마련한 불확실성은 이내 해소될 것이라 라울팔은 예측하고 있습니다.
We're getting to an incredibly interesting by the fucking dip moment, but hopefully you can understand that nothing happening here is out of the ordinary apart from the peak fear narrative. Sentiment is wildly overdone here. And don't forget, coming out of we're going to tariff everybody a gazillion % will be the walk back, the discussions, the negotiations, the agreements, and all of that will take uncertainty out of the market. So on a forward-looking basis, ignore all the work that we've just done. Is there likely to be less uncertainty or more uncertainty in a month's time? It is almost 100% likely to be less uncertainty. Markets hate uncertainty more than anything else. They overshoot when they're trying to price uncertainty, and then they'll price in the outcomes. So it is usually buy the room, sell the rumor, buy the fact when it comes to negative news. This is where we are. We're in a time that is almost as peak fear as COVID was. It's similar to 2018 when the Fed pivoted. These kind of things, even 2008, these things don't come often. But when they come, they're a goddamn fucking gift.
라울팔에 따르면 지금 시장은 불확실한 조정 구간의 끝자락에 와 있습니다. 그리고 구조적으로 유동성은 앞으로 계속 확대될 수밖에 없고 그 자금 흐름의 가장 큰 수혜처 중 하나는 암호화폐 시장이 될 가능성이 크다는 것이죠. 유동성의 방향, 달러의 흐름, 글로벌 균형 재조정까지 모든 퍼즐이 하나씩 맞춰지고 있는 지금 준비된 자만이 기회를 잡을 수 있을 것입니다. 영상 도움이 되셨다면 구독, 좋아요 부탁드립니다. 감사합니다.